Australia, known for its beautiful beaches, wild outback, and their entire population being criminals. Oh, sorry, that was 200 years ago. This time on Chit Chat History, we are here to discuss Australia's beginnings as a penal colony. This video follows on from our previous video about Britain's floating prison ships. If you haven't checked that one out yet, it will be in the links. I would highly suggest watching that before this video. Australia, the landmass, was discovered in 1606 by the Dutch, possibly earlier by the Portuguese. Now, when I say discovered, we must still acknowledge that people were already living there for thousands of years, but the landmass was widely made aware of by the Europeans in this time. In 1770, New South Wales was charted and claimed for the British by Captain James Cook, but they didn't really know what to do with this land, and it wasn't really like they needed any more of it. Now, that was until the American Revolution. In the previous video, we discussed Britain's transportation scheme, sending convicts to its American colonies. By 1776, this was no longer an option, for obvious reasons, and so Australia became the solution to Britain's rising convict problem. They picked a port in New South Wales, named it Botany Bay, believing no one else had claim to the land already, even the people living there. They decided this would be a perfect spot for their criminals to live out their sentence. The first 736 convicts arrived on Australia's shores in 1788, and over the next 80 years, around 160,000 more would join them. The trip proved brutal. It was a 6-month voyage with terrible conditions on the ships, and often almost a quarter to a third of the passengers died on the way. And when I say passengers, I mean people being forced into this journey. Now, life in Australia wasn't that much better than on these hulks. But what were they doing? Essentially forced labour. With so many different people with various backgrounds, the government basically set up a new colony with these convicts. They had labourers, farmers, shoemakers, tailors, cooks, hunters, butchers, and domestic servants, and they were all employed to work. They would still be subject to harsh punishments such as lashings, beatings, and inhumane conditions. And that wasn't the end of the use of prison hulks. They actually brought the system over to Australia too. They were used to house particularly rebellious convicts and for second-time offenders. So they became prisons within a penal colony. Now, as we also discussed in the last video, many of these convicts were not hardened criminals and would have probably gotten away with a slap on the wrist today. There are people like Elizabeth Thackeray, who was 20 years old and given 7 years transportation for stealing handkerchiefs. One listed convict on the first ship to Australia was a 70-year-old woman who stole some cheese. John Kelly was an Irishman who was sentenced to 7 years for stealing 2 pigs. We know a lot about these convicts, and there's actually a site which I'll link below that has a database of all the convict records, which gives names, dates, occupations, and crimes committed. It really is very interesting and very revealing of how flawed this system was. Australia's penal status may have begun as a simple solution to a problem, but it soon became an integral function to the colonial expansion. New South Wales was officially a penal colony from 1788 to 1823, and the population began mainly as convicts and their guards. Within the first few years, convicts were already being freed after serving out their sentences. Many of these now free citizens were able to apply to land grants in Australia and begin their own farms. As the colony began to actually develop, demonstrate opportunity for success, and attract new voluntary immigration, new focus turned to reformation of the convicts. A sort of parole system was developed in which you could be given some freedoms after a certain term of hard work and good behaviour. They were allowed to begin working for themselves and their own properties, as long as they stayed in the designated region and reported to their local magistrate. Convicts could also be freed through a pardon, or a conditional pardon, but were required to stay in Australia. One George Barrington was sentenced to 7 years transportation as a pickpocket and served his sentence, then went on to become a superintendent of convicts and a high constable. And since most people were also ex-convicts, there wasn't really any stigma attached. Slowly it became a free colony, not just a penal colony, and transportation was officially ended in 1868. But due to this system, Australia's population grew from 30,000 in 1821 to 1 million by the 1850s. Convicts built many of the roads, infrastructure, and vital needs of its growing population, and the practice of transportation only ended after they weren't needed as free labour anymore. It is estimated that 20% of today's Australians are descendants of these original convicts. And of course, we can't forget the Aboriginal people of Australia, who were pushed from their land and forced to watch as it was taken over and repopulated. The date of the first convict fleet landed was January 26, a date now celebrated today as Australia Day, also called Founding Day, Invasion Day, and the National Day of Mourning. And it's so important to recognise all three of these perspectives. And so it was the American Revolution and Britain's floating prison ships that led to Australia's beginnings as a penal colony. Hopefully you learned a few things about how terrible the prison system was, and maybe reconsidered what going on a cruise might have meant back in the 18th century. As always, thanks for tuning in. Let us know if you learned anything new, and we'll see you next time.